Okay, so battery ran out on me and I had to crank that sucker up. Only took about 3 hours to get it to recharge. Anyway, remember right now I'm just telling you about the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was part of the process of the British to try to regain the lost revenues associated with the 7 Years' War. So quick recap on the Sugar Act just to get myself back up to speed. I told you that it was passed in 1764, of course. This is in the immediate aftermath of the 7 Years' War. I told you that it was an indirect tax in the form of an import duty. That duty would be placed upon such items as sugar, coffee, and allspice. The sugar was the major commodity, taxed at a rate of 3 cents per gallon, basically. Not only did they institute the tax, of course, but they also wanted to guarantee that they could collect it, so they created customs officials. I'll put the S on there now to make sure that the S is there. Customs officials whose job it was, of course, to collect the tax. And indeed, they established a punishment apparatus called the Vice Admiralty Court, just in case anyone wouldn't pay it. And the courts were made up of naval captains, of course. And the whole idea was to very much enforce the Stamp Act. Now, the critical issue I think I was just talking about is how the Americans reacted to it. And the answer is that they didn't really. The vast majority of them didn't know anything about it. So it's critical in the sense, and here's our significance, an event leading the Americans towards the American Revolution. But it didn't have that, it's the first major act of the British, but there is no significant reaction. The reaction part is, really is the driving factor towards the American Revolution. But it did make the Americans that were paying attention aware that something seemed to be changing. So even though they didn't really react in a major way, they were just aware that something could be changing here and watching to see what comes next. And of course, what comes next is something will come next, and it's going to have a huge kind of impact. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about the Sugar Act was that it didn't make enough money. So it did collect about 86,000 pounds per annum per year, but that simply wasn't enough as far as the British. The British had millions and millions of pounds of debt, basically, pounds sterling, so they had to find some other way, of course, to try to get themselves, get the revenues that they were hoping for. So almost immediately, as soon as they were done implementing the Sugar Act, they're going to go for something else, of course. And what they're going to go for in the second instance in Parliament was quickly looking for other ways to raise revenues from the Americans, was something called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was passed in 1765. Now, the Stamp Act is not an identification, not because it's not important, because it's like the critical act of the moment. But as you'll see, the story is just a little too big for an identification. So, it's critical for the essay response, no doubt about that, for essay question number 2, but it's not a particular identification. So the Stamp Act was, first of all, a direct tax. We're going to call this one, the Sugar Act was an indirect tax. This was a direct tax, and it was a direct tax in the form of a requirement of a stamp or embossment that would be placed upon any significant paper of value. So any kind of paper that had some kind of meaning beyond, not just simply a piece of paper, but any paper that would be part of a journal, that would be part of a newspaper, that was part of a will, a deed, a trust, or any legal contract, all of these would be required to have a stamp. I need you guys to know that there was no reason for this. These papers had been sold, they had been used, all through the colonial period. It was simply a way, and this was something that they did do. In fact, I think even the United States did something like the stamp, or something like a stamp or embossment requirement. The embossment is where they press it into the paper itself. So like on every diploma, you would see an embossment. But every single paper of value was required to have some form of a stamp or embossment upon it. The cost of these particular stamps and embossments depended on the value of the paper that you were using. For a newspaper, it would be part of a penny, like a halfpenny. For a contract or a deed, it would be a percentage of the actual contract. So you go anywhere from, less than a halfpenny stamp tax to multiple pound stamp tax upon whatever the value was of the particular activity that was taking place on the paper. Anyway, so this act was enacted for one purpose and one purpose alone, of course, and the purpose was to gain money, gain revenues from the Americans. Now, the critical factor of the whole thing is the fact that this was a direct tax. And because it was a direct tax, implemented, the act was passed actually in March of 1765. So I was looking through the paper not too long ago, and it said it was the anniversary. I think it was like last week or maybe this week, the anniversary of the passage of the Stamp Act. This was past that moment, and the word of it comes over to the colonies relatively quickly. But what it was the first time ever that the British had ever directly taxed the Americans. Now you might think of, so the Sugar Act is a tax, but we would call that an external tax. So it's happening when the goods and commodities come into the country, like coming through the border. And it's paid by the importer, of course, and not by the individuals. This was the first time where they were directly taxed, and direct taxes are things like sales taxes, and of course the income tax would just hit you upside the head basically. How direct it? In fact, you don't even get to see the money, right? It's withheld from your paycheck. But this was the first time in American history that the British had ever directly taxed them, and the way that the colonies are going to respond to this basically is by freaking out. They just are going to explode. And I think the critical way of understanding this, to me at least, is that what happened was that the British changed the rules of the game. Not by you guys, but I am a person who believes in playing by the rules. Once you start your game, you play by the rules. And any time that anyone, of course, begins to diverge from those rules, I'm going to have a problem with that situation. I've been sort of a terrible sports parent upon occasion. And the times that I have been this terrible sports parent is when I believe that the referees had somehow, violated the rules, had gone away from the rules. When my daughter played in a CIF volleyball game when she was in high school, the referees lost track of the score in the fifth game. This is where they only played a 15, and I was going to decide the entire match. And I was so angry with them. I was just like going ballistic up in the stands essentially. And first of all, what happened was that our team lost the game, and then they at least recognized the fact that they lost control, so they allowed it to have one more point play and put it back to original score. The other team was still ahead by 1, and they played through, and our girls were crying and had tears in their eyes and stuff like that. And they screwed up that play, of course, and they did actually lose the match. And I was just so angry with the referees who had lost track and they'd lost control of the game and had violated, in my estimation, the rules essentially. So on their way out of the gymnasium, I stood kind of positioned myself. I wasn't going to do anything physical, that's not my way. But I was going to read them the riot act on the way out, and I gave them every single profanity that I could possibly think of, and some that I just invented for the occasion. Anyway, I was something of an embarrassing sports father. I was kicked out of a soccer match one time because I was giving the ref a little bit too much of our time. And every time I did it, I was just making like a joke. I think I said to the ref one time, he called a foul on one of our players, and I just said a little too loudly, "So you just decided to give them the ball, I guess." And that was enough to anger him, and he kicked me out. And then when my other daughter was playing volleyball, I was in a match, and we were razzing the referee a little bit, and I think in a legitimate way. But the referee walked over to our coach and said to our coach that if the parents don't calm themselves down, he's going to kick somebody out of the gym. So the coach walked across the gym to where we were sitting and told us that, And so I said a little too loudly as she was walking back, "Well, I've been kicked out of better places than this." And of course, that was enough for the referee to kick me out of the gym. And it was quite embarrassing for me to have to walk across the walk of shame and going outside and having to wait outside and my daughter, of course, was horrified by the entire situation. Anyway, I'm a person who believes in playing by the rules, and you don't want to deviate. You don't mess with the rules once you start it. Well, the colonies believed that the rule of the colonies was that they would not be directly taxed. And at that moment, I think we're looking at like 160 years of colonial history. There had never been a direct tax that had been placed upon the colonies, and this is the first time they did it. And the colonists believed that at least they would suggest, that if they had been directly taxed from the beginning of the colonial experience, then of course they would have to agree with it, because that's the rules. But if they'd gone over these century and a half of period without any direct taxes, the colonists are going to see this, of course, as this is not the way it should be. It's not the way the game should be played. This is not. It's a violation of the rules. So what's going to happen in response to the Stamp Act is the Americans are going to explode in a massive protest against this. And I have to tell you, the protest will be so comprehensive and so effective that the reality is that the British government will never collect a dime as far as the Stamp Act is concerned. And of course I can tell you without any reservation, because there were no dimes in those days, but I don't think that they collected any kind of money or very little money in association with the Stamp Act, because the Americans simply decided that they were not going to tolerate this. So we see the Americans beginning to explode in protest, and the protest is so dramatic and involved that I have to kind of subdivide it for you to give you a sense of the different manifestations of protest. So here we go. the first reaction of the colonists, remember I told you they were highly politicized, very aware, very astute, and very much able to be activated. The first form of protest that will begin to appear is what we're going to call social protest. Social protest primarily in the form of civil disobedience. These are the colonists themselves simply saying, hell no, we're not going to go along with this, and we're going to fight this whenever we possibly can, okay? So let me just build the kind of story a little bit for you. So the act was passed in March of 1765, and the word, at some point, it takes a while, of course, for the word to come over to the colonies. They're going to hear about it probably like in the late spring, early summer of 1765. They are then going to, have to kind of get their head wrapped around that, basically, decide what they think about the whole thing, and then ultimately, of course, they're going to react to this. So by the time we get to the summer of 1765, things are just primed and ready to basically to explode. Just a little side note, and I don't know that this is the case, but the 60s have been always a difficult time in American history. The 1760s are protests leading to the American Revolution. The 1860s, of course, is the time of the Civil War. The 1960s, Vietnam, and the great protests of that particular period. All I'm saying to you guys, if you're there in the 2060s, maybe get a hard hat. Who knows what's going to happen. But anyway, this was, what was going to happen in the summer of 65. And by the way, the summer of 65 in the 1965, was also kind of a volatile moment, of course. That was when Watts exploded. But this was the summer of 1765. It was a long, hot summer, basically. And I think just all of the things that were happening, the recession that had kind of impacted the colonies, the Stamp Act coming into play, of course, the American attitudes towards it, even the fact that it was really hot, all these things might have come together, of course, to cause an essential explosion. Now, the explosion is going to occur in Boston, and it is so dramatic that I can tell you the exact moment almost when it began. It's going to begin on the evening of August the 14th, 1765. And so what happened that day, it was a hot day in Boston, basically. There was what we call a hanging in effigy. So hanging in effigy means to hang like a doll. It's kind of like a political voodoo dynamic where you take a representation of a person, or it could be a symbol for a nation, you turn it into some kind of a doll. It doesn't have to be overwhelmingly identifiable. You can have like something that would be a statement on the chest or something like that would tell you who this person was or what it represents. And then, of course, when you say hanging, and you're not just putting it up, you're putting a noose around it, of course, and you're hanging it, hanging it from whatever you're going to hang it to. And clearly, it is a manifestation. It's an ancient form of protest, but clearly an indication of hostility. I mean, if I walked into a classroom one time and found myself hanging an effigy, of course, I would know that's not a good thing. That someone's really unhappy with me in some particular kind of way. I have to tell you that I've never hung anything in effigy. That's not really a form of protest that we do too much anymore. Though you see it in the Middle East sometimes when there be protesters against like Uncle Sam, they'll have an Uncle Sam thing dressed in red, white, blue, and they'll have it hanging, and then they'll light it on fire or something fun like that, all right? Anyway, the only time I even contemplated, and here I'm going to try to tell you my little funny story, contemplated any kind of hanging effigy was when my daughters were little. And so here's the story about, I never played with Barbies when I was a little kid, Barbie dolls. I was aware of Barbie dolls. My sister had Barbie dolls. I had my G.I. Joes, to be honest with you. And there were a few times where we would kind of get the Barbie dolls and the G.I. Joes together to do some funky little stuff together. But, I never did play with Barbie dolls. Not that there was anything wrong with playing with Barbie dolls. If I'd played with Barbie dolls, that would have been okay. But, so here I am, a kid, not playing with Barbie dolls. I grew up, of course, not playing with Barbie dolls. I get married, not playing with Barbie dolls. I have children, not playing with Barbie dolls. And then I have two daughters. And my two daughters kind of fell in love with Barbie dolls. And I must admit that we were a little bit excessively permissive in terms of the Barbie doll situation. I feel like when we'd be in a store and they would want something, the Barbie dolls were, at that time I think they were like $7 or $8 a pop or something like that. So we would often get them. And pretty soon they had their big Barbie doll boxes, their big pink boxes, and they were full of everything. Of course, they had a Barbie car, they had all this Barbie stuff. And anyway, I always used to hate it when they would open the Barbie box, because all the Barbie clothes would just kind of explode all over the place. And, there's nothing quite so bad as stepping on a Barbie high heels when you're bare feet. That's going to hurt really badly. But the thing is that it's hard to dress a Barbie doll. Their thumbs stick out. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the Barbie doll. I know very much about them. The thumbs kind of create these hooks. Even the little fingers a little bit in the way, sort of. So my wife was working, and I was often home with the kids, was doing my graduate work. And so I ended up having to dress Barbies hundreds and hundreds of times, And Daddy, will you put this in? Of course, that's the thing I guess you do when you play Barbies, you change clothes all the time. And I was just getting tired of having to do this. And so part of my imagination kicked into gear. And I thought that maybe I would tell my daughters that I didn't want to do the Barbies by putting a noose around their neck and like dangling from the ceiling or something like that, of course. And I want you to know that I never did that. It was just a fantasy that I had in my kind of head. And I was thinking about all the therapy issues and my daughters would say about me in the future. Anyway, I got to tell you that if I had done it, it wasn't technically hanging an effigy because that was hanging an actual Barbie. But if you hang an effigy, of course, you're hanging something it's a form of a kind of powerful form of protest. So on that August day, August 14th, 1765, in the Boston Commons in Boston, there was an hanging in effigy. And the man that was hung in effigy, and of course it's not the actual person, it's just a representation of that person, was a man by the name of Andrew Oliver. Now, Andrew Oliver was the newly appointed official who was in charge of collecting the stamp tax. So he's got a particular position that's important at that particular moment, okay? And, it was just a representation of him, probably didn't even look like him in any kind of way. They probably put Andrew Oliver on his chest so everyone would know exactly what's going on. They put a noose around the neck of the effigy, they hung it from the tree. And, all during the day it was sort of there and becoming something of a draw for the community. Walking by, they would see this effigy sort of hanging there. Anyway, nothing happened during the day. It was just too damn hot, and just the way it was at that time. But as soon as the sun went down, as soon as it began to cool off a little bit, of course, then the crowds began to gather. And all of a sudden, that effigy of Andrew Oliver became a flashpoint. And a huge group came together. They held a mock funeral where they cut down the effigy, of course, and they had words said about this, primarily in protest, of course, against the Stamp Act. They then proceeded to take the effigy and just parade it through the streets of Boston, really windy streets of downtown Boston. And you got a picture like 500 men walking there. They're carrying torches, of course. They're carrying the effigy. As they go by, I'm sure they were very noisy. People would come out of their households. Others would decide to join them, essentially, just to gain everyone's attention, of course, and associated with their protest over the Stamp Act, essentially. Well, they proceeded to go through the town of Boston, and they made their way down to near the wharf area. And down at that area, they found themselves in front of a brand new building, and the brand new building was an office created for the collection of the Stamp Act. And what they decided to do, of course, was to destroy that building. There's an office for the Stamp Act. And I guess, 500 people with their hands can destroy a building in about 35 minutes, because that's exactly what they did. And they took they destroyed the building, and they took then the wood that came from this office, and they paraded the wood through the town, and they went up to in front of this really nice, big, beautiful home, essentially, and they piled the wood all up into a big pile, and they lit it into this massive bonfire. And that bonfire just happened to be in front of Andrew Oliver's house. So Andrew Oliver came out that evening to find 500 of his not-so-close personal friends out there, fairly angry and protesting out in front of the house. They proceeded then, Andrew Oliver was forced to come out basically. He was asked to renounce the Stamp Act, and he, being of sound mind and wanting to maintain his sound body, he did that absolutely. He was then allowed to leave. The family was allowed to leave his house, but then the protesters went into the house basically and began to just destroy everything. Fine china, of course, the furniture. They found a fairly substantial wine collection down in the basement. They decided not to destroy that, but rather to imbibe that. And they ultimately went out to his barn, destroyed his carriages, and then when they were done, they burned the whole thing to the ground. So I don't know how you guys are feeling about this, but I'm feeling a little bit of animosity being generated as far as the protesters were concerned. They proceeded then to go to other houses, including the house of the comptroller of the customs. So this was the man who was in charge of the customs officials in Boston, and they destroyed his house. They then proceeded to the house of the register of the Vice Admiralty courts. He was the person in charge of the Vice Admiralty courts, and they burned his house to the ground. And for good measure, they went to the house of the Chief Justice of the colony of Massachusetts, And because even though he was a native son of Massachusetts, in fact, he was a Hutchinson, and he was a descendant from Anne Hutchinson, he was very much pro-British in supporting the Stamp Act, and they burned his house to the ground also, okay? So you just see this, concerted effort on the part of the protesters of Boston to demonstrate their hostility to the symbols of British oppression, at least as far as they could see them. Now, it would have been very interesting to witness that night, of course, and I'm not sure how exactly we would feel about that. It would look something like, of course, a riot taking place throughout the city of Boston. But I want you to know that it was a very kind of directed riot, if it was. It's a mob action, no doubt about that. And if you looked into the mob, if you looked into the people there, and most of the guys who were doing it were the working men of Boston, but you would note that among them were these members of the Boston elite. It's really a deferential society manifestation. And these individuals were kind of guiding them from place to place. Okay, let's go here, destroy this. Let's go there, destroy that. So you have a very systematic destruction, not a general destruction, a systematic destruction of only those things that represented the power of the British government, basically. Now, those individuals who would lead that initial protest that night decided that they will organize themselves, and they will ultimately become known to us as the Sons of Liberty. And I should have a little thing to hold up for you guys, but I just forgot to do it. The Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were the first proto-revolutionary body to form themselves, at least as far as colonial America was concerned. There was no intent at that moment, of course, towards independence, but they were clearly, it's an indication of the desire to overcome the Stamp Act, to overthrow the Stamp Act, and to make sure that the British, of course, didn't interfere in this particular kind of way. Now, the social protest was not limited to Boston. You see similar activities in Philadelphia. You see similar activities in Charleston, South Carolina. The one place where it just got out of hand and went crazy was in New York. And on October 31st, 1765, New York explodes in a monster riot. The residents of New York kind of go running down the streets of Manhattan, and the argument is that they were like breaking all the windows they could find, of course. So that means that they're going a little more, just general violence rather than specific violence. Though the only buildings that were actually destroyed were, again, those associated with the Stamp Act, the Customs, and the Vice Admiralty Court. So even in the mayhem of New York, the primary targets were against those things that they were protesting against the British. Now, most Americans didn't live, of course, in these cities. So the way they protested in the countryside was just to gather together to build monster bonfires, and of course to have a bonfire rally in protest again. It wasn't an uncommon phenomenon for the bonfire rally. And when I'm talking bonfire, I'm talking about like a bonfire the size of a house or something like that, just monumental, to attract the attention of the community, to come together, of course, to express their very much ill will towards the Stamp Act. Now, the social protest was, of course, the number one form of protest that began to explode upon the scene. But fairly quickly, especially among the leaders of the colonies, there was a desire to express exactly what they were doing. So I'm going to call this intellectual protest. Intellectual protest, just something that was very American. The Americans always wanted to explain exactly what they were doing, exactly how they felt about something. So one of the things that becomes very notable about the protest was the fact that they began to both speak out and write about what exactly it was that they were so unhappy with in regard to the Stamp Act. Now, various individuals become involved in this. John Adams wrote something. James Otis was a very prominent intellectual from Massachusetts. Patrick Henry's going to write something and give a speech on these. There's a number of these guys who begin to express themselves in one way or another. And all of them kind of rallied together to create the great slogan of protest of this era. And I'm not going to say it's the greatest revolutionary slogan that they have, at least in the modern era. The French Revolution had liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. That's a pretty powerful revolutionary slogan. The Russian Revolution had land, peace, bread, or some combination of those three words. Essentially, very straightforward, of course. The American slogan is just a little bit more complicated and legalistic, and I'm going to see if you can guess it before I put it up there. The Americans would protest against the Stamp Act by saying, 1, 2, 3, no taxation without representation. This is, of course, the great protest slogan of this particular era. Now, I do want to kind of, parse this unpack this for you guys a little bit, just to make sure we understand what's going on. First of all, we need to understand that the Americans did indeed believe in taxation. They weren't totally against the concept of taxation, but they believed that it could only occur in a certain circumstance. And the essential circumstance of that moment was, of course, if they were being taxed by people that they voted for. So you can be taxed with representation. You simply cannot be taxed without representation. From the American point of view, they were not represented in Parliament. In fact, some of the protesters at that time, that was their call. Let us have representation in Parliament, and we'll discuss the issue, basically. But without any representation, the Americans, of course, simply said, well, if we don't vote for you, you don't have the power to tax us, essentially. Now, the British did not recognize this, In Great Britain, there's the Parliament, and the Parliament was elected by about 15% of the population, most of whom were members of the elite. So that means 85% of the people don't even get to vote as far as Britain is concerned. So for them, that's not the way that representation worked. And what they would do, what the British argued ultimately, was that they believed in what we call they believed in virtual representation. So that meant that the Parliament virtually represents everyone in the empire based upon history and precedents and the fact that they had done it for a very long time. All those kind of things gave them the ability to tax. It's just the way it had always been as far as the British were concerned. But the Americans said, no, it's got to be actual representation. We have to actually vote for you to actually vote to tax us. So I don't want you to think the Americans are just a bunch of people that want to get out of taxes. They understood the need for taxes, but they simply thought that the only people who can tax us are the duly elected governments. It's part of that political culture of representative government that they believed in absolutely in their soul. So they wanted to make sure, of course, that the British understood that what's going on here. We're just not freaking out because we want to freak out. We're freaking out because we believe that, taxation is only associated with representation. And without it, of course, we're unwilling to pay any kind of tax. Now, I need to let you know that the British were freaked out. They were alarmed by everything that they were seeing, of course. The social protest was just amazing as far as they couldn't believe that it was kind of happening. And indeed, their interpretation was that the Americans were just crazy, and the Americans were just a bunch of spoiled brats, unwilling to, accept kind of the realities of the burden of taxation. The British also rejected the intellectual arguments. They said, no, no taxation, that doesn't make sense. Parliament always has the power to tax everyone who lives within the British situation. So they were unwilling to accept this notion, of course, that representation is the foundation of taxation. So there are two forms of protest which the British basically dismissed. The one is just the Americans throwing a temper tantrum, and the other one is just wrong-headed. That's not the way that the world actually works. So the Americans had to come up with a third form of protest, and this was the one that's really going to have an impact, basically. And so this is, you hit them where you can hurt them. And protest, nonviolent protest, but in a way you can do significant damage to them. So just for fun, I'm wondering if you can guess what kind of protest is going to be. So 1, 2, 3, guess. Yes, you're right. It's economic protest. The Americans knew that the British were economically dependent upon them for the strength of their economy. So the Americans knew that if they protested in an economic manner, that this could actually have some impact. And the way that they would protest, can you guess the way you protest economically? 1, 2, 3. Yes, indeed. They're going to institute a boycott. Boycott, has no real meaning unto itself. It was simply a person whose name was Boycott. But the boycott individual argued for a protest where they would not buy the goods from whoever that they were protesting against. And from that time on, of course, any time that you refuse to do business with any kind of company or entity, that will become a boycott. So the Americans decided that they would institute a boycott against all British goods. And the thing that I find so impressive is that when the Americans said they were going to do something like this, they didn't just say it, they did it, and they just quit buying good things from merchants that were bringing stuff, importing things from Great Britain. So here's how this impacted the British. The Parliament did not respond to the protests of the Americans, but the Parliament was forced to respond to the protest of British merchants. British merchants are trying to sell goods to the colonies. All of a sudden they're losing all of their business, of course, so it wasn't the screams of the Americans that the British Parliament heard, it was the screams of British merchants who basically were telling Parliament, you're killing us, we are getting hurt here, essentially. And Parliament just kind of roils because of this. And so amazingly, less than 1 year after the implementation of the Stamp Act, because of the monumental protest of the Americans and the impact that it has upon the British merchants, the Stamp Act is repealed. So that becomes a major victory as far as that was just fun to do that. As far as the Americans were concerned. I do want you to understand the dynamic of this moment, basically. Of course, so the British repeal the Stamp Act, and they have to make that statement. And it happened in March. It's passed in March of '65. It's repealed in March of 1766. So, and I think it was less than one full year as you get from one point to the other. And of course, the British will be reeling from this. I'll tell you about that in just a second. But you can imagine how the Americans felt about this. Their notion was that they had gone eyeball to eyeball with the British, and the British blinked. The Americans didn't blink. And in many ways, if you want to kind of play the story out, you pretty much see the British losing it in that moment. I don't know that if it would have made a difference, if they'd forced the Stamp Act upon the American people, if that would have had a difference. But because they backed away, and the Americans were victorious, so everywhere there had been a protest, now there's a huge monumental celebration, basically. The Americans gained this sense of self that, if the British try to mess with us, we're going to mess them up. We're going to do the same thing we've done here, and we will defeat everything that they will possibly do to us. And so this is like, a lesson learned from the Americans. If we need to, we will defeat the British. And the fact of the matter is the British will never really be able to implement anything significant upon them in the aftermath of the Stamp Act. So I do want you guys to know that the Stamp Act was devastating for the British. It hit hard, what can I say? It caused a vote of no confidence in terms of the Parliament. The Prime Minister had to step down. There's going to be a series of Prime Ministers that will kind of try to come up and pick it up. And one was an individual by the name of Lord Rockingham. He was very old, and I think he died relatively quickly. And then there was William Pitt. And William Pitt had been the Prime Minister way back at the time of the French-Indian War, so he's elderly too. And what happened was that the weight of the government, and I'm sorry I actually had this, so Lord Rockingham was the first of these prime ministers, and then William Pitt is the second one who kind of stepped forward. But because of just the weight of this moment and the fact that William Pitt was a little too elderly to deal with it, the problems of the government, the Parliament, fell upon this other individual, and his name was Charles Townsend. And Charles Townsend his position within the government is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And I have to tell you that I've always just thought that's a really cool name, if nothing else, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. When I first saw it, I had no idea what the hell it is, and I don't know if you can guess what in the world it is, but it almost sounds like the person who's in charge of the people who used to be the checkers at the grocery store or something like that. But Exchequer, the primary word there is the check. So what this really means is that the Exchequer is the treasure of Great Britain. So Charles Townsend was the essential treasurer of Great Britain. So he had his finger on the pulse of the government in terms of their financial situation. And of course, he was the one who knew how much the government owed and how much the government needed to try to get money, and especially money from the colonies, okay? So Charles Townsend is placed in the position of trying to figure out new ways to get revenue from the colonies. Now what he does is, he does a little bit of a history lesson. And so he's just looking back at what's happened so far. And he says, looked at the Stamp Act, and he saw that that was a monumental failure, and the Americans didn't like that, and they got pretty pissed off about the entire situation. But then he took a step and looked farther back, and he remembered the Sugar Act. And the Sugar Act was not protested at all. So he thought, okay, well maybe we should kind of go back that way, essentially. We'll go back towards the idea of an indirect tax in the form of an import duty. And what he did was he actually created a whole bunch of these things. So they're little individual import taxes, that were import duties that were placed. But they're always collectively known as the Townsend Duties. And the Townsend Duties is indeed a potential identification for you guys. And if you'll note, the date on that is 1767, okay? So Charles Townsend, Chancellor of the Exchequer, tried to come up with new ways to get revenues. So he's going to go back to the idea of the import duty. So we're returning. And I just wrote this, I just said it to you guys. We're returning to the concept of an indirect tax in the form of an import duty, same way that the Sugar Act had been before. Okay, and the idea was that if the Americans hadn't protested the Sugar Act, then the Americans probably wouldn't protest the Townsend Duties. Although I'm going to tell you in a second, that's not the way this is going to go. Okay, so here's the big deal. The Townsend Duties are like the Sugar Act, at least in some ways, indirect taxes in the form of an import duty. But in so many ways that they're very, very much different, and the Americans were keenly aware of the significant difference. So let me just reiterate the Sugar Act for you guys. So that was an import duty on such things as sugar, coffee, and allspice. And the critical thing is, where do those items come from? And I don't know if you guys can guess where they come from, but I will tell you that they're coming primarily from the Caribbean and South America. So these are items that are coming from the New World area, the Western Hemisphere area, and being exported north into, of course, the North American area. So the Americans perceive them in many ways as kind of like an international trade. And they believed that the British had the right to tax international trade. But here's the critical thing with the Townsend Duties. The items of the Townsend Duties are going to be significantly different, and here they are for you guys. So we're looking at such things as paper, we're looking at paint, we're looking at glass, lead, and probably most infamously tea. These were the primary items that were to be covered under the Townsend Duties. So paper, paint, glass, lead, and tea. And the critical question I would ask you if we were all together is, where do you think these items are coming from? So I'll give you 1, 2, 3, and hopefully some of you said they're coming from Great Britain, all right? So these aren't international trade items. These are essentially imperial trade items. They're within the British Empire. And these are things that would be produced in Great Britain and be brought over to America, and the Americans would buy them. As soon as the Americans saw what these items were, they began, of course, their protest dynamic. Because, for them, there's a whole bunch of problems here. Basically, they saw the British as double dipping. They're paying. The Americans paid them for these goods. They pay them good money for these goods. And of course, Great Britain benefits every time the Americans buy any of this kind of stuff. And so now they're putting a tax upon that, an import duty upon that. And part of it was the double dipping kind of component of the whole thing. Part of it was that the Americans simply, of course, their back was up and they're ready to try to fight any of this kind of stuff. So the Americans, of course, decide that they are not going to adhere to the Townsend Duties. They're going to protest them almost exactly in the same ways that they had done before, okay? So I'm not going to belabor the story quite as much for you this time, but I want you to remember the 3 major methodologies of protest. The first thing, of course, was social protest in the form of civil disobedience. They simply were going to do everything they could to stop this particular activity. This is where the Sons of Liberty began to really manifest themselves. It became an increasingly large organization. I do want you to know that there were auxiliary groups for, like the Daughters of Liberty began to appear, the Gay and Lesbian Liberty. I'm just kidding, that wasn't one of them. But anyway, all these kind of advocates of liberty began to present. And the social protest this time was much less spontaneous, much more controlled in many ways. And they planted liberty trees, and they did all this kind of stuff to guarantee the British would understand their hostility to it. Of course, they're going to pull out the guns of the intellectual protests. It's going to also, of course, be no taxation without representation. This worked exactly in the same way that it worked with the Stamp Act as far as the Americans were concerned. So this becomes another vital suggestion of protest. But as I'm sure you guys can imagine, the most important thing that they're going to do in terms of protest was economic protest against, in the form, again, of a boycott. And it's not hard for us to imagine, of course, what items they are not going to buy. They're not going to buy paint, paper, glass, lead, and tea. They say, screw that. We're not. And I want you to know that that's not really true. They're not going to buy anything from the British. And the decision was that if the British are trying to sell us something, we're not going to buy any of this. A colony-wide boycott. And again, the impressive component of the story is how the Americans, when they said they're going to do this stuff, they did it. They refused to buy these goods. I have to tell you that it actually has kind of a profound impact on behavior in America. Americans love their tea. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a bit here, how much the Americans love their tea. Well, all of a sudden, of course, it became a boycotted item, and the Americans had to find some kind of the drink. And so I always think to myself that this is pretty much the foundation of the rise of the importance of coffee in America. And indeed, Starbucks could kind of thank Charles Townsend for promoting, of course, for moving away from tea and promoting the potential promotion of coffee in terms of American consuming behavior. Anyway, so the Americans implement this, and I got to tell you just one little kind of story of this anecdote of this moment. The Americans would put, the Sons of Liberty would put like little announcements of the stores that sold British goods, merchants who were selling British goods on a kiosk that would be located somewhere in the town. And so when I first read that, I thought, okay, so they're telling the Americans not to go there. They don't want them to go there. But that's not the truth, Really, they put those announcements on the kiosk to make it so that Americans would go there and pretty much beat the crap out of those people, the merchants that are trying to sell British goods. This was their intention. And just to tell you how horrific, this is the kind of thing that, forgive me for telling you this kind of stuff, but I can't help myself. But one thing that was kind of a problem of that moment was that Americans had way too much access to human excrement. They used chamber pots and buckets and stuff like that. So it's available. There's nothing so wonderful as a flushing toilet, right? It's not available because we don't want it to be available. We get rid of it as quickly as we possibly can. but Americans had access to this. So they would find that there was a British merchant selling British goods, and they would take human excrement and they would smear it all over the building, okay? Now, I don't know how you guys would feel about this, but if that was anything I had to do with, I would burn it down rather than want to have anything to do with it from that point on, basically. So this was shows the extent of the Americans' desire to really protest against the Townsend Duties. Now, I do want you to know that the British tried to stick with this one for a little bit longer, okay? They did not automatically repeal it when the protests and the boycott began, but ultimately by the time we get to 1769, so that's 2 years into the story, the British are reeling again. The British merchants, of course, can no longer sustain themselves in the face of the loss of the trade. They're complaining to Parliament, and so Parliament again will repeal that Townsend Duty. So the British are basically 2 for 3 in terms of what they're trying to do, because the Americans are so aggressive in terms of their protest against this. Anyway. It shows us, of course, the protest dynamic. It becomes another critical event leading us ultimately to the American Revolution. But here's one last thing about the Townsend Duty, which I find just fascinating. This is the last time the British ever tried to tax the Americans. And you would think to yourself, if the British aren't going to try to tax the Americans, then we really shouldn't have any kind of a major problem. There shouldn't be an issue from that point on. But sometimes, in this conflict dynamic, other things can step forward to become part of a dialect of conflict. Something else can become part of it. It doesn't even have to focus necessarily on, for instance, taxation or something like that. So indeed, that's exactly what's going to happen. And the way I'm going to present this to you in the first instance is I'm going to just simply tell you that something's going to happen in Boston. I'm going to call it the trouble in Boston. And this is going to happen in March of 1770. And what I'd like you to do is kind of just, if you're taking notes, you just draw a little blank there that you're going to come back and fill in. We just know something bad's going to happen in Boston in 1770. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going on here, okay? So all of this began with the fact that the Massachusetts General Assembly decided to write a letter of protest in regard to the Townsend Duties. So they wrote a circular letter, and the circular letter indeed had the letterhead of the Massachusetts General Assembly on it, and it called for a repudiation of the Townsend Duties and a boycott against it, all right? And the letter was then circulated throughout the entire colonies. Well, you can imagine, of course, the letter could get into the hands of the British government, and indeed it was put into the hands of the British government. It makes its way back to Parliament and to the monarchy, and of course they're very, very unhappy. Their understanding was that the Massachusetts General Assembly should represent the empire. They missed the boat here entirely, but thinking it's the governing apparatus as far as the colonies are concerned, and it shouldn't be calling for protest against the legitimate government of Great Britain. So Parliament decides to punish Massachusetts for what they had done, and they're going to do 2 things. And the first thing they're going to do is they are going to prorogue or shut down the Massachusetts General Assembly. And this was the first time ever that the British had interfered in the activities of a duly elected assembly of the American colonies. And I'm sure you guys can imagine how the Americans are going to feel about something like this. Here are the British trying to shut it down. Now, I do want you to know that they were never able to shut down the Massachusetts General Assembly. All they could do was they could secure the building, and that's the old State House. It's located in downtown Boston. Kind of cool. Almost always when you go there, there's going to be British soldiers or guys dressed up as British soldiers walking around there. Pretty old building, of course, you can go into as a museum part of it. So they shut the building down, but that doesn't matter. If you're an assembly, you can go wherever you want to. And I have to tell you, all they did was they walked down the street about a block. They crossed over the street and they met in the Old South Church. The Old South Church was the largest church. And if you go to the Boston State House, of course, you just walk down the street and go to the Old South Church. And so the Massachusetts General Assembly was never ceased to function. It continued to function. And if they had shut them out of that church, they'd find a barn, somewhere out in the countryside or something like that. There's no way you could stop this. So this was a very ineffectual punishment, but all it really did was it offended the sensibilities of the people of Massachusetts and the people of the colonies. So that's one thing they did. They shut down the Massachusetts General Assembly, and then fairly quickly realized that was dysfunctional, and so allowed the Massachusetts General Assembly to meet. More importantly, though, they decided to send. I missed one. Oh well, they decided to send 2,000 Redcoats to Boston. 2,000 Redcoats to Boston. It was a classic show of force, of course, and a show of displeasure. You're garrisoning a large, substantial number of soldiers in there to control the situation. They didn't like all the protest activities that had been occurring in Boston, but also just a show of displeasure, a show of force to recreate control, to create control for themselves over the situation. Now, Boston was a city of about 20,000 people, so there are 2,000 Redcoats in a city of 20,000 people. So 1 out of every 10 people that you're going to see was a Redcoat. And as you can imagine, it disintegrated into a relatively toxic situation very quickly. The soldiers were kind of this presence that was always there, and they're kind of in your face on a daily basis. They would be patrolling through the city all day, so it's very difficult to go anywhere in the city without seeing the Redcoats. And the Americans perceived them as like an alien army, which in many ways that's exactly what they were. But there were problems of that they would have to remove people from their homes. There had been something called the Coercive Act, which allowed the British to remove Americans from their homes so that they could garrison their soldiers in particular buildings and things like that. There was a curfew established, and you guys all know that curfews for kids are pretty much acceptable, but curfews for adults are something that Americans really aren't going to go for in any particular kind of way. Anyway, there was a lot of sexual harassment issues. You've got these young soldiers in the city. I have to tell you, there's problems like this, of course, all over, including like Okinawa with American soldiers and situations of rape and things that have occurred, with American soldiers. But, here there were the British soldiers, and they were simply living in the city of Boston, of course, with its entire population. And of course, the interactions with women became increasingly problematic in many ways. And I need you to know that, if you look at what happened between the Redcoats and the women of Boston, it ran the gamut, of course, of what potentially could happen, all the way from they fell in love, they got married, they lived happily ever after, to rape over here, and everything in between, basically. But the general notion of the Americans, especially the men of Boston, was that the soldiers were predators, sexual predators, that were preying upon the women of Boston. Of course, this really began to amp up the hostilities that were there in Boston at that time. Finally, one of the big problems was that the soldiers weren't paid very much money, and they had a lot of free time, and so they would try to moonlight. They'd try to get another job, and there really weren't enough jobs to go around in Boston, so the Redcoats began to be seen as economic competitors. They're competing for the jobs, and the whole thing had this kind of toxic build, which of course was just primed basically to explode. And so we reach like late February of 1770, and events began to happen which kind of would blow up in the face as far as Boston was concerned. So the first thing was the death of a young boy by the name of Christopher Seider. So Christopher Seider was an 11-year-old boy. One of the intriguing manifestations of activity in Boston was that the people of Boston just totally disrespected the soldiers. And so even the children kind of got in on the act, so like little kids would chuck rocks at the soldiers. And you would think that that's a really bad idea, of course, but it just shows the general social attitude. I don't know if you guys have heard anything about this, but the British Army, of course, has occupied parts of Ireland, especially North Ireland, for a long time. And there are, especially those areas of the Catholic Ireland, where the British soldiers, who were generally representing the Church of England Protestant, there would be a presence. And there was an extreme hostility between the two groups, the soldiers and, of course, the population. And I remember this was when I was, younger. I would see there'd be TV footage of little children, like a 5-year-old, throwing a rock at a British soldier or something like that. And the problem was that sometimes these soldiers are going to just turn around and shoot the kid. I mean, they're hardly going to look before they shoot. And of course, then it became a real huge issue for the community. So they were trying to figure out non-lethal ways of dealing with this. They came up with rubber bullets, like shoot the kid in the butt, and really hurt him or something like that, but don't kill him. But even a rubber bullet could kill if you hit the kid in the right place, essentially. And then the beanbag kind of thing began to come out there. Anyway, but the same thing that was going on in North Ireland was happening in Boston, where even the children are getting caught up in the activities. So one day, these two young men of Boston, boys of Boston, so Christopher Seider was the main character I want to tell you about, and his buddy, they're walking down the street in Boston, and they see a British official. He wasn't a British soldier, but he's a British official, and of course everyone knew who the British officials were. So the two kids just decide to harass this guy. So they take out a couple rocks and they're chucking it at the guy, chucking it at this individual. Now what the boys didn't know was that behind them was another British official. He's watching the whole kind of drama unfolding. And the guy was armed with a pistol. And in the deposition he said that he fired a shot to warn the boys off, but the shot went right through the back of Christopher Seider and kills him. So here is this young boy of Boston who's now been killed by the authorities of the British government. As you can imagine, I mean, nobody knew this kid. He's just a total unknown street urchin kind of kid, and hadn't even been in Boston that long. But his death became what we call a cause célèbre. And the Sons of Liberty decided to play it to the nth degree, and that meant that they held a huge funeral, and they had this beautiful coffin, little white coffin made for the boy, of course. And you guys all know that a child coffin is always going to be very evocative. And then they paraded the white coffin through town, and the white coffin was followed by 500 little boys all dressed in white as a symbol of their innocence, essentially. And they were then followed by about 1,000 working men of Boston, with no innocence whatsoever, just extraordinarily mad about the situation. So the death of Christopher Seider just amps up the animosity and the problem, to a very high degree. A couple days later, some soldiers are walking down to the wharf to try to get some job, and they get jumped by some of these working men of Boston. So you have these soldiers that are getting beat up, and the soldiers are returning to the garrison, of course, with black eyes and broken ribs and stuff like that. So pretty much you've got everyone on edge. By the time we get to the early part of March in 1770, the city is about to explode. Anyway, so the actual day that this is going to happen is March the 5th, 1770. And on that day, and I love how stories begin kind of with a really innocuous kind of dynamic and become really problematic very quickly. But on that day, there was a barber in Boston, and he'd given a haircut to a soldier, and the soldier didn't have the money with him, but he promised to pay, but he hadn't returned to pay. So the barber assigned his 13-year-old apprentice the job of finding this soldier and getting him to get the money from the soldier. So this kid is just sent out on a fool's errand, throughout the city of Boston. There's 20,000 people, there's 2,000 redcoats, and this kid's going to have to find this one soldier and try to get the money for the barber that he worked for. And the barber told the kid, don't come home until you have the money. So this kid's really, he's going to have to find this guy if he just even get home that night or something like that. So he's wandering through Boston. He can't find this soldier. The sun starts to go down. He's just kind of, walking through the streets, trying to figure out what the hell he should be doing. And he's met up with some of his buddies, and they're like probably going home, and they're just like, "What are you doing, man?" And he tells them, "I'm trying to find the soldier, trying to get some money from him." So now it's like a group of 4 boys, and they're walking down the street together. And they look ahead, and this is right in the downtown area of Boston, and they see a British soldier just standing sentry. Now he's not the soldier that they're looking for. He's just a sentry. But the boys are like, let's give this guy some trouble because that's what you did. You gave the British trouble. So the boys, this is March, it's cold in Boston, so they put together some snowballs and they're tossing at this guy, and he's just standing there, And the dynamic of this moment is I think what intrigues me. So a little bit of a conflict begins, just a small one, with a soldier and maybe a few boys. But it reminds me of like being in high school, and there would be a fight that would break out in high school. And it's like all of a sudden you had a feeling that something was happening. And I remember coming out of class one day, and I feel like I'm going, there's a fight, And I think it's that. And then also I saw the people already. It's that way, of course. It's like you could feel what's going on. And I think when the boys started to harass the soldiers, it just like this telegraphic message went out that there is a conflict brewing as far as Boston is concerned. The word heads down to the wharf. There's a bunch of the individuals who are working down, the working men of Boston down there. These guys are itching for a fight. I mean, they want to fight. And so they're running down to the downtown. They're grabbing clubs. They're grabbing bricks. They're grabbing stones. Anything they can. These guys wanted to rumble. There's no doubt about that. And pretty soon, this poor British sentry standing there, guarding this door, he's surrounded by what's becoming an ever larger mob. Well, someone does ultimately get back to the garrison, and they basically say, you've got a soldier downtown, he's at risk, you better do something about it. So a captain and 5 soldiers make their way down, and I have to tell you, they have to like squeeze along the building to get even next to the soldier because the mob has just taken over the entire area. And they're there, and of course they do have muskets, and they lower their muskets towards the crowd, essentially, trying to just ward them off. But through this, there are snowballs flying through the air. There are rocks that are kind of flying through the air. There's a lot of people just yelling profanities and stuff like that, okay? Very, very tense situation. And what happens, and this is absolutely documented, is that an American, some colonist started, so he took a club and he cold cocked one of the soldiers. So he hit the soldier in the first instance. And the soldiers, without order, in spontaneous fashion, then fire into the crowd. And as they fire into the crowd, they will kill 5 of the working men of Boston. There will be 5 of them that will be killed. And will forever be known from that point on. And for some reason, I don't have my little card for this, but I'm sure you guys have heard of this. This is the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre. Aren't you glad that I'm not writing too much for you guys? It is hard to see, but I hope you've heard of the Boston Massacre. I want you to know that it kind of suggests to us that there's always been political spin to some degree. You guys all know that what the story that I've told you is not really this. I'm trying to get that way so you can see Boston Massacre. But the story I've told you is not a story of a massacre at all. It's really intriguing, of course, that it will be, this is the way it's relayed to the rest of the colonies, that the soldiers have killed these innocent civilians or something like that. When Paul Revere and others did an etching of this for publication, they sold kind of depicted the soldiers in a line like a firing squad, and these men of Boston kind of standing away against the wall, like they just lined them up against the wall and shot them. And indeed, the reality was that these soldiers were under significant duress. In fact, they were attacked in the first instance, and when they were firing basically in self-defense. And I want you to know that every single one of them would be exonerated from this. In fact, John Adams will defend them. There's almost no punishment that will go down to the British because everyone ultimately understood exactly what's going on. But see the spin of the whole thing, to present this as the Boston Massacre, and just understand the way that would inflame, of course, the larger population. I did want to tell you a little bit about the 5 guys that were killed. These were all working men of Boston: Patrick Carr and Samuel Maverick. I used to remember all their names. I can't remember all of them, basically. The one I always feel the saddest for was a 16-year-old boy, and the boy was actually leaving the crowd. He's leaving the mob, and a bullet somehow wound its way through everybody, just hit him in the back and killed him. So he's not even really an active participant. Of all those who died in the Boston Massacre, the most famous by far, though, was this man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a very impressive human being. He was 6'5" at a time when the average American probably was going to be more like 5'9". He was 250 pounds. I mean, this guy looks like he could have been a linebacker in the NFL or something like that. Anyway, he was targeted. It's clearly he was targeted. He was in the face of the British, but the critical factor of Crispus Attucks was that he was an African American. So an African American was one of the first to die in the cause, of course, of American liberty. He'd been born a slave, but he'd run away from slavery, became a sailor, then became a working man of Boston, and ultimately became kind of a leader of the working men of Boston. So he was there in the face of this British soldiers, and clearly they targeted him with an intent to kill. So anyway, Crispus Attucks will die in the Boston Massacre. Now, ultimately, the most important thing, of course, in the story is what does this mean for the entire situation? And I got to tell you, the Boston Massacre has a very interesting sort of ultimate outcome. On the one hand, it is the highest moment of drama in this whole story. I mean, all of a sudden, they're killing these Americans, and it just has this huge impact. On the other hand, the result is that everyone kind of backed off. It does not amp up the problem. It actually caused everyone to kind of take a big step back. I'm not sure this is a perfect analogy, but I always like to tell it to you because it's part of my life story. But I came home from school in 1971 to find out that 4 college students had been killed at a place called Kent State University. These were protesters against the war in Vietnam. They were killed by National Guardsmen. It was just a really chaotic situation where the students were like down in one particular area, and the National Guardsmen, who were untrained in confronting kind of mob activities, decided to move them out of there. So they began to kind of just forcibly march, and the students began to run in front of them. And there was tear gas, of course, that was sent to the students, and the students were sometimes grabbing the tear gas and throwing it back towards the soldiers. And anyway, they get over a hill, and then the students are kind of all just out in this parking lot area, and and these canisters and things are being thrown, there's no doubt about that, but in a spontaneous fashion, without order, some of the soldiers fire. They shoot their guns. And the end result was that they killed four students. And, I'll never forget, it's the Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph of, there's a body kind of laying in the parking lot, and the blood you can just see is pooling around the body. And a young woman is kind of like almost on her knees, like with her hands up like this, what in the world is going on, this kind of thing. Anyway, there's the way that almost all Americans felt that moment. So I remember coming home and hearing about that, and I go, God, they're killing them now. The protests have gotten so intense that they're actually killing these American student protesters. Now, interesting thing about Kent State was that Kent State is like that peak moment of protest activity. And from that moment on, everybody backed off in a huge way. The students didn't, they were protesting going to Vietnam because they didn't want to get killed in Vietnam. Well, they don't want to get killed in America either. And so they're going to start to back off quite a bit. And of course, those that were part of the law enforcement apparatus realized that they had totally misplayed the situation, that you can't send untrained National Guardsmen into a situation where they, becomes this chaotic. So they begin to back off the way that they're going to manage the whole thing. So Kent State did not lead to an increase in violence on the campuses of America, but instead, led to a real calming down of the entire situation. And the Boston Massacre is exactly the same in outcome. Everyone realized that they had pushed it all too hard. The British realized that they had pushed it too hard. They removed the soldiers, the garrison out of Boston, and have them outside the city rather than in the city without all of this continual interaction. So they're going to back off. The Americans realized that they had pushed it too hard, and of course that they in many ways had caused the shooting to take place in the beginning. I told you already that John Adams will defend the soldiers, and he's going to get them all off, basically, saying that they fired in self-defense. So what happened was not an intensification of the problem, but rather a backing off. And it creates this really kind of interesting moment between 1770 and 1773. And during that time, to be honest with you, nothing happens. The British aren't doing anything. They're just like, they've thrown up their hands on the entire situation. The Americans are basically like, woo, that was weird, and everyone basically thought it was back to the way it had been before, things had calmed down again. So they're just kind of cruising along with no taxation, no interaction, no big things are happening whatsoever. And that will last until 1773. And when 1773 comes along, the British are going to do what we call the penultimate. So the penultimate would mean the second to the last thing that will lead us ultimately to the American Revolution. And the penultimate act of the British government was something called the Tea Act of 1773. And it's a very interesting enactment, which the thing that's so interesting to me is it really doesn't have anything to do with it does have something to do with Americans, but that's not the focus of this issue. But this will be the beginning, the straw that's going to break the camel's back, at least in terms of the colonial relationship. So let me tell you about the Tea Act of 1773. Now, the thing that's interesting to me is that essentially it's not the focal point of the act is not the colonies at all. Instead, the focal point of the act was the East India Company. Now, the East India Company was this monumentally large, very powerful financial entity as far as England was concerned. Intriguingly, very much in its origins, like the Virginia Company, it was founded in 1600. I think it was the last day of 1600. The charter was signed by Queen Elizabeth, who was still alive at that time. And so it's very much, a group of merchants who came together to create a company to economically exploit an area. Now, the Virginia Company failed, of course, because their area of activity was going to be Virginia. The East India Company's area of activity was going to be India, Asia, and China. So clearly it's not the same story at all. And the East India Company will last for 258 years, and it became one of the richest companies as far as America was concerned, or excuse me, as far as the British were concerned. So it was a great company, it was a powerful company. It will come to actually rule India. In fact, they acted as the government agency. Indeed, there were soldiers they had, there was a navy they had at their disposal, all of it basically to maintain control over the Indian subcontinent. But even though it was wealthy and powerful, it wasn't always poor, it wasn't always well run. And periodically, of course, it would have some difficulty. And in the 1770s, that was what was happening. And indeed, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, this is a classic case of too big to fail. The British government could not allow the East India Company to fail. It was too important for them, okay? So they had to do something about that. And what they're going to do about that, of course, is pass the Tea Act. So the Tea Act is designed basically to prevent economic distress promote the economic situation as far as the East India Company is concerned. It's not about the Americans in particular, it's about the East India Company, okay? But here is the way that they decided that they would help the East India Company. They would give the East India Company a monopoly of the sale of tea as far as the colonies were concerned. Now, the colonies consumed about 1 million pounds of tea per year. And you guys all know that tea is really light. So 1 million pounds of tea, that's a lot of tea. Essentially, this was the drink of choice, the hot beverage of choice as far as the Americans were concerned. And so the government knew that by giving the East India Company a monopoly of the sale of tea, then that would at least be something that would promote their economic situation and hopefully, improve it so that they would avoid bankruptcy. Now, one of the interesting realities associated with the Tea Act, and now the East India Company is going to sell the tea to the Americans, was that the East India Company had the best tea in America. And it wasn't just I shouldn't have said it, best tea in the world. And indeed, the East India Company would have to sell the tea at a cheaper price, So the ultimate result of the Tea Act for the Americans is they're going to get better, cheaper tea. And I don't know about you, but as a consumer, better and cheaper always sounds like a good thing, And really, there is no significant damage that would be done to the Americans whatsoever by the Tea Act. But that doesn't mean that the Americans are going to accept that, even though there would have been better, cheaper tea for them. They're going to be offended by a number of things associated with this. They didn't like the concept of monopoly. They thought that was a bad idea. They primarily, though, were very much hostile to the idea that the British would have they could overwhelm the smuggling of the Americans. The Americans would smuggle tea, and of course illegal tea, so this would impinge upon American business activities. And part of it was just simply that the Americans didn't want the British to do anything. I mean, they're like I told you, it's all about non-interference. So regardless of the fact that the Tea Act is not, it's beneficial to the Americans. I mean, it's not detrimental to their well-being whatsoever. The Americans decided to protest the Tea Act, okay? And they will protest in a variety of ways. We're going to see protests in Charleston, South Carolina. There's going to be protests in Philadelphia, primarily just to attack the tea, destroy the tea, or force the ships of the tea, the East India Company, out of harbor and things like that. But of all the protests, the one that was most famous was the one that's going to occur in Boston. And it's going to occur on December the 18th, 1773. And I want you to know that at that time, in the immediate aftermath, it was simply known, of course, as the incident in Boston. There was no other label that was attached to it in any particular kind of way. But over time, of course, it would become known. In fact, it wasn't really called this until about the early part of the 1800s. They're going to call it the Boston Tea Party. So the story I'm about to tell you is the story of the Boston Tea Party, which was the result, of course, of the Tea Act. So on that December the 18th, there was a mass meeting that was held in the Old South Church. So this was a place they would come together because they're politicized people, they're aware, astute, and activated, and they were wanting to try to figure out a united protest against the Tea Act. So they got together there. This is Sons of Liberty, and of course just people who lived in Boston, to listen to speeches, of course, of protest, and to figure out what kind of action they should take. So of course they decided they didn't want the tea to come into America, and I screwed up this. 3 ships from the East India Company had arrived in the harbor. So they're sitting there, and the question becomes, what's going to happen next? So from this mass meeting, there is a small committee of individuals who were sent to see the royal governor. And they were to request that the royal governor tell those ships to leave the harbor. And so they go to the governor and they say, tell him, will you please tell these ships to leave? And of course the governor says, no, I'm not going to tell them to leave. I mean, they have every right to be here. This is basically adhering to the laws of the British Empire, basically. So the governor wasn't going to be any help, and they didn't expect him to be any help anyway. So the committee, that small group of people, come back to the mass meeting. They tell the speaker what's happening. The speaker does some kind of a signal system or something like that. And about 60 men then just leave this mass meeting. And they go home and they create for themselves crude Indian disguises, leave it to the Americans to blame the Indians for everything, basically, or try to blame the Americans. They then reassembled down at the harbor there, and they proceeded to board these 3 ships of the East India Company. I have actually known the names of a couple of them. I can't tell you. They weren't really big ships, though, I have to tell you that part of it. Just these are smaller ships. And they basically told the captains what they were about. And the captains realized, that there wasn't much they could do to stop this. So they simply made a deal with the protesters. They said, if you please don't touch anything other than the tea. You can do what you want with the tea, but leave the rest of the cargo. And these guys basically did that. They're not going to do anything. So they had to then unload the tea out of these holds of the ships. And I have to tell you, that wasn't as easy as it sounds. The tea was stored in wooden boxes that were lead lined, so super heavy. And all that was designed, of course, to protect the dryness of the tea on an ocean-going voyage. So they had to lift these things out of the hull, out of the cargo space. They had to get them onto the deck, of course, and then they had to unload the actual tea and dump it into the harbor. And over the course of that evening, they're going to dump something like, and I'm always a little confused, it's either 10,000 pounds of tea, or it could be 10,000 pounds worth of tea. And I'm never sure. It's a lot of tea. I know it's a lot of tea, one way or the other. And so they're dumping it over. I don't know if you guys know, but you can go to Boston and they've got their little tea party thing. It's kitschy, costs you a little bit of money, but it actually was kind of fun. You go into this little place which is supposed to be the Old South Church, and you have these people dressed in period costume who are talking to you. Then you get to go out to see the ships that are replicas of the ships. Then you actually get to take the tea and throw it over. Now it's mostly the kids who do that, of course, but I waited in line and I wanted to make sure that I threw my tea, and of course got a picture. My wife took a picture of me. And I have to tell you that the boxes that you're throwing, of course, are attached to a tether, so you throw them out and then they drag them back in so the next person can throw them out. But still, it was fun. What can I say? I've actually done the Tea Act activity. Anyway, they're throwing the tea into the Boston Harbor, of course, and I can only imagine what it was like the next day. Have all of this tea just floating there in the harbor, and this incredible aroma, of course, that must have just been generated by all the tea that was there. Now, when the British hear about this, they cannot believe it. They just can't believe that the Americans would go. They're providing the Americans with better, cheaper tea, which seems like it's a benefit to the Americans. And yet, what do the Americans do? They destroy the cargoes. They're destroying this tea. And so the British decide that they've got to do something about it, and they've got to punish the Americans. We all know that it's pretty much too little too late, and they're going to do this, but this is the decision that's going to come down. So in the year 1774, I didn't write the date here, they're going to pass what is the ultimate act of the British relative to the Americans in this moment, something that became known as the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts are kind of what they sound like. This was an attempt of the British to force the Americans to behave themselves. And really, it was an attempt to punish the people of Massachusetts and the people of Boston for the various activities they conducted. And among the Coercive Acts, a variety of things are going to happen here. They're going to shut down the port of Boston so no one can go in and no one can go out. It's a way to squeeze, of course, the economic life out of the city of Boston. They offered special protections to their soldiers. In fact, you could actually kill an American and get away with it if you were a British soldier at that time. They allowed for the quartering of soldiers in houses. They could pretty much just come and kick you out if they wanted to. They would forbid mass assemblies or the gatherings of people. One thing that's interesting is that if you look at the Bill of Rights, two of them are directly responding to the Coercive Acts. That you cannot quarter soldiers in the houses of an American citizen, and that Americans have the right of assembly. You can't forbid them to assemble, essentially. So there was a variety of things that were designed, basically, of course, to punish the people of Boston. Well, the Americans called the Coercive Act the Intolerable Acts. In other words, they would not tolerate them. And it meant that for the people of Boston especially, that things were beginning to go far beyond just this issues of breaking with Britain. We're getting to a point, of course, we just need a little spark to light off an entire conflagration. But the Americans prepared themselves for potential conflict this time. They began to want to really link up with each other, so they created what they called committees of correspondence, and the committees were really that just means like a committee of letter writers, So these guys are writing letters back and forth to kind of coordinate activity and to understand what everyone is doing. So, and in many ways, these are more of a proto-independence body that's beginning to build the committees of correspondence. In New England, there was a decision to gather weapons together to protect themselves. So we find them compiling arsenals at places like Concord, bringing in powder and shot and muskets and maybe small cannons, stuff like that, just in case it will go to a real military conflict. And most importantly, in especially Massachusetts and New England, the individuals there began to form something called, it was the militia, but it was a special manifestation militia. The idea was that the men would be ready at a moment's notice. If you've ever seen the statues of these guys, they show them with a plow, but the musket's right there, ready to grab that musket if they need to, of course. And I'm sure you guys know that they were ready at a moment's notice. They were called the 1, 2, 3. Yes, indeed, they were called the Minutemen. Okay. And one really bad joke, I want you guys to know that there is no truth to the ugly rumor that the Minutemen were called Minutemen by their wives and girlfriends. I don't know where that came from. It's an ugly rumor. We need to dismiss it right now. There was no rumor, of course. I just made up a stupid joke. But anyway, what this shows is that the people of Massachusetts, at least in New England, are preparing themselves for conflict. And when we get to this moment, of course, all there needs to be is one small spark that can light up a general conflagration. And that's going to come at Lexington and Concord. And the story will no longer be breaking with Britain. The story is going to be, of course, war and revolution, which I will bring to you next time. Okay. Anyway, see you next time.